The Korean 23-24 ski season has officially started, with Yongpyong Ski Resort being the first to open on November 24th, with 2 beginner runs and 1 advanced run open. And the rest of the ski resorts in Korea will follow shortly. There's a lot of people that will want to travel to a ski resort this winter, and as an expert skier who's lived in Korea for 10 years, I want to give a rating of my top 5 ski resorts here for people to check out this winter. But before we start, I just want to mention that I haven't been to every ski resort here. I've been to 8 of the most popular ones, and my wife and I plan on visiting some of the ski resorts we haven't been to yet this year. So stay tuned this season for videos on them if you're curious. And before we start, I just want to give a huge disclaimer that nobody should come to Korea only to ski or snowboard in my opinion, as the snow is man-made everywhere, the slopes are narrow, and there can be huge crowds of people, especially on the beginner runs. But if you're planning on coming to Korea in the winter and want a fun activity to do, then it's a great idea to go and have some fun at the resorts here. In my ranking, I'm going to break down each of my top 5 resorts in the following categories out of 5. Also, since the top 5 resorts are not that close to Seoul, I'll start out with a bonus resort, which is my most recommended resort closer to Seoul, which was actually Bearstown, but it hasn't been in operation for a while because of a lift accident a few years ago. So I'd have to recommend Vivaldi Park, even though it's my least favorite resort personally. Vivaldi Park is located just over 60 kilometers away from Seoul in the province of Gangwon-do, just like every resort on this list except for one, and has 10 lifts and 12 slopes, 3 beginner, 7 intermediate, and 2 advanced, at about 6.8 kilometers of total slope length. The slope quality is actually not too bad for being near Seoul, but the snow quality is not great as it has a base elevation of only 282 meters and a summit elevation of 576 meters, which isn't that high, so it's constantly warming up, creating slushy conditions, and then freezing over to create a lot of ice. When it comes to crowds, this is where Vivaldi Park suffers a huge hit. It's the most crowded ski resort I've ever been to in my life, but only for beginners. For intermediate and advanced riders, it's a lot less crowded and actually kinda manageable. As far as beginner slopes go, there are 3 total, but one of them is the lesson zone, so I'd say there's only 2 real beginner slopes, Ballad and Blues. Ballad is actually the perfect slope to learn how to ride on, because it's fairly wide for a Korean slope and not too steep, but since there are so many people, I have a really hard time recommending it, just because you'll spend so much of your time trying to avoid other people. And in fact, I think it's actually dangerous for beginners to learn how to ride here, just so you know. In terms of intermediate slopes, Vivaldi Park is probably the most underrated ski resort in Korea. With 7 slopes total, there's a decent variety of terrain to explore, and there's enough area to disperse the riders between the slopes without too much overcrowding. There are also separate lifts that only service the intermediate and advanced slopes, so even if it's crowded in the beginner area, you can still do pretty fast laps there. And as far as advanced slopes go, there are only 2 of them, and they're basically the same as the intermediate slopes, so I can't give a high score in this category. There is just one tiny section on rock that almost gets steep enough to be called advanced, but that's just about 100 meters of riding or so. Also, unfortunately Vivaldi Park doesn't have a terrain park, so it gets a 0 here. For lift tickets and rentals, Vivaldi starts at 60,000 won for 3 hours of riding midweek and 30,000 won for 4 hours of rentals. The price increases on the weekend too. This is really low value if you want to spend a lot of time skiing or boarding. And just so you know, you can get discounts at the third-party rental shops located outside the resort, but it'll be hard to access them unless you have a car or go by taxi. When it comes to facilities, Vivaldi Park is world class. And this is the #1 reason why it got so popular, I think. For starters, there's a massive underground complex with things like a mini theme park, bowling, an arcade, a big grocery store, a massive food court, and even more. This is absolutely the most entertainment out of every ski resort in Korea. So if you're looking more just to spend a little holiday away from the city and not so much to ski or board, Vivaldi will have you covered. When it comes to accommodation, there are a lot of massive hotels that are very close to the resort, but they aren't cheap at about 200,000 won or so for a weekday, And if it's a weekend, you're either paying about 400,000 won or they're fully booked. so I wouldn't even try. If you have access to a car or want to go by taxi, you can book a pension for about 65,000 won or higher on weekdays and 85,000 won or higher on weekends. And they're just a short drive away from the resort. And then finally for transportation, if you're driving there, expect it to take about 2 to 2.5 hours from Seoul just because of the heavy traffic. And as far as buses go, there used to be a free shuttle bus for foreigners only, but they've deleted the English website now, so I'm not too sure about it. On the Korean website, you can reserve a shuttle bus for 9,000 won each way from a variety of locations in Seoul and the surrounding area. If you can't be asked to deal with the Korean system and translating everything yourself, you can also reserve the shuttle for about twice the price on Trazy.com. So that gives Vivaldi a total score of 30 out of 50 based on my criteria. Barely a passing grade, but I'd say it's worth it for families that don't mind coughing up 200,000 won to have a good time with their kids on a weekday. Now it's time to start the top 5 resorts with the same criteria, with number 5 being Welli Hilli Park. It's just over 110 kilometers away from Seoul, also in Gangwon-do, and has 9 lifts and 19 slopes, 6 beginner, 5 intermediate, and 9 advanced. There's a total of 12.3 kilometers of total slope length, pretty evenly distributed between the levels, and the slope quality is nothing special, but it faces north, keeping the snow in the shade, maintaining its consistency. The base elevation is 573 meters, and the peak is 896 meters, for a total vertical of 323 meters. And as far as crowds go, Welli Hilli Park isn't too bad, because it's less popular than the surrounding ski resorts such as 휘닉스 Park or Yongpyong. So if you have to choose a weekend, I would pick Welli Hilli Park just to avoid the lines a little bit. For beginners, Welli Hilli Park has a variety of slopes on the lower mountain that are all great for learning, but they aren't very long, with the longest beginner slope being S2 at 814 meters. Therefore, if you manage to run into crowds, you'll be spending most of your time waiting in lines instead of on the runs. For intermediate slopes, Welli Hilli is decent, but nothing special. You'll be spending most of your time on the 2 slopes on Bravo, and then you also have access to S1, the longest run at 1800 meters in length, but feels kind of like traversing down a cat track, as it's incredibly narrow and can easily get crowded. For advanced riders, Welli Hilli has a variety of steeper slopes that descend from the very top, and this is where the majority of the terrain is distributed. However, most of the advanced slopes are pretty short, with the longest being C4 at just over 800 meters in length. You won't have to wait long in line if you choose to stay near the top either. And also, to be honest, most intermediate riders can easily handle the advanced slopes at Welli Hilli. And then when it comes to terrain parks, Welli Hilli is a true dark horse. The park is built on the perfect slope that isn't too steep, and it's divided into rails on the left side and jumps on the right side. It's extremely flowy and fun to ride, but lacks a bit in variety to be called the best park in Korea. I'd rate it number 3 out of all the terrain parks I've been to here. And then for lift tickets and rentals, Welli Hilli hasn't published this year's numbers yet, but they were 71,000 won for 4 hours last year, which is a bit steep in my opinion for what they offer. It was also 32,000 won for equipment rentals. However, if you go to third-party rental shops nearby, you can get really big discounts on lift tickets if you rent gear from them, and sometimes if you don't rent as well. As far as facilities go, Welli Hilli has a decent lodge and food court with a variety of options that aren't too expensive, but it's a pretty small village overall. It's mostly just a hotel attached to a lodge, and then it also has the X Mall, which we haven't been to, but inside you can find some entertainment like pool, bowling, little rides for kids, and some restaurants too. For accommodation, there's the big Welli Hilli Park Hotel that's attached to the resort, and it looks like you can get a room for about 90,000 won on a weekday, but it'll probably be fully booked on weekends. Luckily, there are a lot of other options within a 10-minute walk that should be available on weekends, with some as low as 65,000 won. That's quite cheap for a weekend at a ski resort here. And as far as transportation goes, it's about 140 kilometers by car, which should take you between 2.5 to 3 hours depending on the traffic. You can also take the KTX train from Pyeongchang Station to Dunnae Station, and then there's a shuttle bus that takes you to the resort from the station, which is only about 3.5 kilometers away. Or you can take a taxi, which will be pretty cheap since it's so close. But I'd recommend taking the ski shuttle over these options, which can be booked in English for 18,000 won each way on the English site, and 16,000 won one way, or 30,000 won round trip on the Korean site. And that gives Welli Hilli a total score of 35.5 out of 50 for 5th place on my ranking. I'd recommend Welli Hilli mainly to those who have no other option but the weekend to go skiing or riding, or for those who are looking for a nice and mellow terrain park that's not too extreme. The next mountain at number 4 is Phoenix Park, the freestyle mountain known for its terrain park and super pipe, and where most of Korea's freestyle skiers and boarders roam. Phoenix Park is located about 120 kilometers from Seoul in the province of Gangwon-do. It has a total of 9 lifts and 18 slopes, 4 beginner, 6 intermediate, 5 advanced, 2 terrain parks, and 1 super pipe, and a total of 15.3 kilometers of slopes. Phoenix Park is pretty similar to Welli Hilli Park when it comes to terrain. However, it's facing northeast, so it tends to get a bit more sun overall, especially in the mornings, and the sunlight heats up the snow a bit, causing it to melt and then freeze over when the temperatures aren't cold enough. So the snow quality takes a bit of a hit from that, and the conditions seem to be a bit worse overall than the surrounding mountains. The base is at 680 meters, and the peak at 1080, for a total of 400 meters of vertical. In terms of crowds, Phoenix Park tends to draw crowds of young skiers and boarders because of its freestyle scene, and it can be crowded near the bottom of the mountain, especially on weekends. However, it's not so bad up top where most of the advanced runs are located. In terms of beginner slopes, Phoenix Park only has about 21% of its slopes dedicated to beginners, but the slopes are generally wide enough so they don't get too crowded on weekdays. I just try to avoid weekends if possible, since the majority of the crowds will be on the beginner runs. When it comes to intermediate slopes, Phoenix Park is pretty good, with 6 runs to choose from, all spread throughout the mountain, including Phoenix Park's longest run in Panorama, which is 1.4 kilometers, and links up with Sparrow to make it a total of 2.4 kilometers. For advanced skiers and boarders that aren't looking to hit up the park, Phoenix Park is pretty limited, to be honest. There are 5 runs to choose from, including 1 mogul course, but they're not that challenging overall, and they're almost identical to one another. And with the mediocre snow, they get pretty icy, to be honest. And now it's time to answer why so many people go to Phoenix Park, the terrain park. Phoenix Park is the clear #1 mountain in Korea when it comes to freestyle, because of how much they invest into it and just how much effort they put into it. There's the main park with a big variety of rails and bigger jumps, and then a mini hike park as well with a bunch of rails and smaller jumps to session. They also have a full-on super pipe, and it's now the only one in the whole country. There's also a big airbag jump to practice tricks on before taking them to snow, so I'll give the terrain park a 4.5, with the mediocre snow taking off half a point. When it comes to lift tickets and rentals, Phoenix Park advertises their main lift ticket for 6 hours at 90,000 won, which is on par with other resorts in Korea, but not really good value in my opinion. And it's 30,000 won to rent gear for the day, but there are third-party rental shops within walking distance of the resort to get discounts. The facilities at Phoenix Park are decent. The lodge is pretty spacious with a variety of food to eat in the ski house, but it's all pretty expensive unless you want to go upstairs to the Loteria to get some fast food. However, if you're willing to walk about 5 to 10 minutes outside the resort, there are some other restaurants surrounding the ski area that might be worth going to instead. There's also a water park called Blue Canyon, which has an indoor hot tub that can be used in the winter too. There's also other entertainment inside, such as a bowling alley and an arcade. When it comes to accommodation, Phoenix Park is pretty loaded with nicer hotels attached to the ski hill, such as the 휘닉스평창 Resort for about 200,000 won on weekdays and about 300,000 won on weekends if it's not sold out. There are also cheaper options about a 5 to 20 minute walk away from the resort, starting at about 50,000 won on weekdays and 80,000 won on weekends. And lastly, let's talk transportation. It's about 155 kilometers from Seoul to drive there, so it should take about 2.5 to 3 hours depending on traffic. You can also take the KTX train to Pyeongchang Station in about 1 hour and 40 minutes, and then hop on the shuttle bus to get to the resort from there. Or the easiest method is to reserve the ski shuttle bus from Seoul for 17,000 won one way or 31,000 won round trip, but you have to do this in Korean, or it's 19,000 won to book on the English KD Tour site. So that gives Phoenix Park half a point lead on Welli Hilli Park at 36 out of 50. When it comes to freestyle skiing and boarding, Phoenix Park is the best place to go in Korea hands down. But if you're going just to ski or snowboard, it's better than all the mountains near Seoul, but the snow quality and weekend crowds mean that Phoenix Park isn't as good as the top 3 in this list. Now we are at the top 3, and to be honest, from here it might as well be a 3-way tie, as they're all very good for Korean standards for their own reasons. But if I were to give an objective rating, I'd rank Haewon Resort the 3rd best mountain in Korea. And I'd actually give Haewon first place if it had a terrain park, so if you don't care at all about freestyle skiing or boarding, then this is my number 1 pick. Haewon is located 168 kilometers from Seoul, in a very uncivilized region of Korea close to Taebaek City. There are a total of 9 lifts and 15 slopes, 5 beginner, 2 intermediate, and 8 advanced, for a total of 23.2 kilometers of skiable terrain. It's also very obvious that the runs are longer on average than any other mountain in Korea. It seems like no matter what run you choose, you always get a lot of uptime actually riding rather than just standing in line at the lifts. Haewon is located in one of the most mountainous regions of Korea, and it's quite a bit colder as well, so the snow quality is by far the best out of every resort we've ever skied in Korea. We've even had some powder days here before, which are almost non-existent here in Korea. It's reasonably high in elevation, with a base of over 700 meters and a peak of almost 1400 meters for a total vertical drop of 659 meters, the 3rd most in Korea. When it comes to crowds, because of Haewon's remote location, it doesn't get as busy as the other resorts in the top 3 of this list. And the lifts are all very fast and modern, meaning the lift lines move very quickly, and since Haewon is relatively big, it's not too hard to avoid people on the mountain. As far as beginner slopes go, Haewon is the best resort in Korea by far, no comparison. The runs are long and wide enough to accommodate a lot of riders at once, they aren't that steep, and over 40% of the terrain is dedicated to beginners, so there are a lot of places you can explore without getting tired of doing the same runs over and over again. For intermediate riders, Haewon only has 3 official runs, but Athena 2 is arguably the best run in Korea for intermediate riders, at over 1600 meters in length and a lot of slope variety that snakes down the mountain. There are also a lot of runs that are labeled as advanced, but they're very similar to the intermediate runs, such as any of the runs off the Hera chair. So there's enough variety to have fun for a full day of riding. And then for advanced riders, Haewon is about as good as it gets in Korea in my opinion. 45% of the slopes are dedicated to advanced riders, so there's a lot of variety to choose from. And most of them are serviced from the same area at the Valley Hub, where you have access to the Hera and Victoria lifts. Haewon also has some of the steepest runs off the Victoria chair, and since the snow is pretty consistent, it's pretty fun to rip down and feel the adrenaline from going so fast. You aren't going to get the tree runs or cliff runs that you'd get in other countries, but if I'm just comparing it to other resorts in Korea, Haewon comes out on top. And now for the terrain park, which they used to have a really fun park, but it closed permanently, and there are no signs of it returning now. So unfortunately, Haewon gets a 0 here. As far as value goes, lift tickets start at 58,000 won for 3 hours, with rentals being 27,000 won, so it's on par with the other resorts in Korea. If you're renting gear, I'd recommend renting at a place in Sabuk or Gohan, 2 villages accessible via free shuttle bus, as you'll get better discounts there. And speaking of facilities, they're absolutely amazing. The lodges and lifts are all brand new, there's a variety of food to eat that's not overpriced, and things just feel like a different level at Haewon. They put a lot of work into the details, like parking underground and taking an elevator up to the ski house. It's very well designed, and the only reason I'm taking off half a star is just because there's a bit less entertainment than other resorts for families. But there is the only casino in Korea that allows Koreans to gamble, for those who are interested. Also, for accommodation, Haewon has some really nice hotels located right on the mountain. They look to be mostly sold out on the weekends, but on the weekdays, you can book them for about 150,000 won per night, which is fairly reasonable to stay at a hotel right next to the mountain. If you don't care about staying a little bit away from the hill, look at staying in Sabuk or Gohan, where you can find motels on weekends for as low as 60,000 won a night or 50,000 won on weekdays. It takes about 3 to 3.5 hours by car at about 220 kilometers away from Seoul. Also, you can take the train from Cheongnam Station in Seoul to either Sabuk or Gohan, which have free shuttle buses that run pretty frequently between the 2 towns and the resort. There's also the ski shuttle that leaves from Seoul and costs 24,000 won for one way, which is a bit more expensive than the other resorts. And that gives Haewon a total of 37 out of 50, and that includes the 0 out of 5 rating for the terrain park. Haewon is really fun for skiers and boarders of all levels, the facilities are top notch, and since it's deep in the countryside, it's cool to explore Sabuk or Gohan just to see how people live over there. Now we go all the way down to Jeollabuk-do, to Muju Deogyusan Resort. This is the only ski resort in this region, but it packs a heavy punch to bring it to number 2 on this list, for feeling the most like a traditional Korean ski hill, with a massive old school village. It's the furthest away from Seoul on this list at 196 kilometers away, and has a total of 14 lifts and 21 slopes. 3 for beginners, 7 intermediate, and 11 advanced. A total of 21.8 kilometers of slope length, with the longest slope in all of Korea, Silk Road, at 6.1 kilometers long. Muju boasts the most vertical in Korea, at 796 meters of vertical, with a base elevation of 724 meters and peak elevation of 1520, the highest of any resort here. Higher up on Muju, it's quite cool, so the snow is very consistent. I'd give it second place to Haiwon in this category, but lower down on the beginner runs it tends to warm up because it's a lot further south, and the snow can easily melt and freeze over, creating ice. And then when it comes to crowds, for intermediate and advanced, there are so many runs spread throughout the mountain that it's quite easy to avoid them. However, since there are only 3 beginner slopes, and Muju is the only mountain in this region, the beginner runs can definitely get pretty crowded. And that's why I'd give them a 3.5 out of 5. There's an amazingly long beginner run called Soyeok-kieng, and it's the longest beginner slope in Korea at a length of 3.4 kilometers, which is absolutely perfect for beginners, especially when there are long lift lines, so you can spend a lot of time riding and not just waiting around. When it comes to intermediate runs, Muju is top class in Korea, and I'd say the best overall, with the 6.1 kilometer Silk Road being really entertaining, starting out at the top near a fortress wall and snaking down through the mountain with some amazing views and an overall really fun run. There are a total of 7 intermediate runs spread throughout the mountain, making it easy to avoid the crowds and put in a lot of laps. And for advanced skiers and boarders, I'd give Muju 3rd place in Korea. It has its fair share of advanced runs, a total of 11, but they're all pretty short when compared to Haiwon or Yongpyong. However, it shouldn't prevent you from going, as the intermediate runs are also pretty fun overall for advanced riders. And when it comes to the terrain park, I never got the chance to try it out when I was there, but it looked pretty good. There was a decent jump line, with jumps comparable to Welli Hilli Park, but not as big as what you'd find at 휘닉스평창 Park or Yongpyong. And then it looks like there are about 4 to 5 rails beside the jumps. I'd say just by looking at it, it would be the 4th best terrain park in Korea. And then when it comes to lift tickets and rentals, you can get 4 hours of riding for 61,000 won, and rentals for 28,000 won. This is quite reasonable, considering the size of the resort and how much you have access to. As far as facilities go, Muju is definitely showing its age with some older lodges and lifts, but that's part of what gives it its charm. Most ski hills in Korea have kind of a newer feeling, but going to Muju has an old and unique vibe to it that makes it kind of special. However, the food options were a bit limited, to be honest. Also, if you stay in the village, there aren't any theme parks or bowling alleys or anything either, so it might be better to go to Yongpyong if you're going as a family. For accommodation, there are some amazing places to stay nearby in Shimgongni for very affordable prices as low as 35,000 won on weekdays and 60,000 on weekends. But if you want to stay at the resort, you're looking at about 135,000 won or up, and I haven't found an easy way to reserve it unless you have a Korean ID and phone number. It seems like you would have to call the phone number in advance to reserve it if you're a tourist. And lastly, we have transportation. Muju takes about 3.5 hours by car, but it doesn't have an official ski shuttle from Seoul like all of the other resorts on this list. You have to take a bus from Nambu Bus Terminal in Seoul to Muju Terminal, and then when you get there, you can take the free shuttle bus to the resort or take a taxi for about a 20-minute ride, which is probably the safest option. However, unless you live in Korea and know how to do things here, getting to Muju from Seoul will be a bit of a hassle. And with all that, Muju gets a 38 out of 50. It's an amazing resort with a traditional Korean vibe that I'd recommend for anyone who wants to create a special trip to the Korean countryside. It has its own charm that no other resort I've been to in Korea has, and that would make it worth visiting in itself. And now it's time for number 1, which for those who live in Korea won't come as a surprise, and that's Yongpyong. This is the best all-around ski resort in Korea, and the safest option for people to travel to, especially for families, because it's the biggest resort with a fairly large-sized village and lots of entertainment as well. Yongpyong is 149 kilometers away from Seoul. It has a total of 14 lifts and 21 slopes, 4 beginner, 6 intermediate, and 11 advanced. for a total of 24 kilometers of total slope length. It has the highest base elevation in Korea at 745 meters, but the peak is a bit lower than Muju at 1450 meters, giving it 705 meters of vertical, the second most in Korea. Because of the massive diversity of terrain and elevation, I'd rate the slope quality quite high because people of all levels can find a good slope for them. And the snow quality would be about the same as Muju, which both are a bit worse than Haiwon, but second best in Korea. And as far as crowds go, Yongpyong definitely attracts a lot of people, as it's probably the most popular ski resort in Korea. However, Yongpyong is big enough to handle a lot of people, especially on weekdays, as the runs are spread throughout different lifts and areas, making it so not everyone is waiting at the same choke point. As far as beginner slopes go, it's nothing special to be honest. Only 12% of the mountain is dedicated to beginner terrain, and the longest run, Mega Green, although quite wide, is only 700 meters long. However, there are two lifts right beside each other in the yellow zone, where most of the beginners ride, so they definitely do a good job trying to handle the lines, as this is where the most people will be. And when it comes to intermediate riding, Yongpyong is great. 47% of the mountain is dedicated here, with the 5.4 kilometer Rainbow Paradise run taking up most of that. However, to be honest, Silk Road at Muju is a lot better than Rainbow Paradise, because Rainbow Paradise is quite narrow, and it feels kind of like going down a cat track. For advanced riders, I would say Yongpyong is a bit better terrain-wise than Haiwon for the best terrain overall in Korea. This is where they did the Olympic ski and snowboard racing during the Pyeongchang Olympics, and in the Rainbow Zone, you get a lot of steep runs to get going pretty fast and have a good time. However, Yongpyong just doesn't seem to have the same snow quality as Haiwon, so I think although it's very close, Haiwon just edges Yongpyong out. And when it comes to the terrain park, Yongpyong has the nicest built features out of any resort in Korea in my opinion. The jumps are fairly big, with the landings being nice and high when compared to the lifts of the jump, to give you a lot less impact than the step-down style of jumps that Phoenix Park and Welli Hilli Park seem to have. There are also some rails before and after the jumps. However, the park is built like a slope-style course, so if you just want to session some rails or something, Phoenix Park definitely takes the cake for the best park in Korea. When it comes to lift tickets, Yongpyong is a bit more expensive than Muju, starting at 65,000 won for a 4-hour lift ticket and 34,000 won for rentals. Also, since Yongpyong is built like a big resort, it's not easy to get to the third-party rental shops for discounts in Daegwallyeong without a car or taxi. Then we have facilities, where Yongpyong is top-notch. The lifts and lodges are amazing, with the most variety of food of any resort. And you can even get halal food here, which is pretty rare for a Korean ski resort. And then for après-ski, there is a karaoke, a bar area for beer and cocktails, a big arcade with pool tables, and an amazing bowling alley, and all of this is attached right to the ski hill. If you're staying at Yongpyong, you'll have plenty of places to eat at and enjoy as a couple or family. And then as far as accommodation goes, luckily Yongpyong opens their reservations up to foreign websites as well, making it a lot easier to reserve than Muju, for about 190,000 won on weekdays and about 300,000 won on weekends if you can find a room. Outside of the resort in Daegwallyeong, things get a lot cheaper, starting at about 80,000 won on weekends and 60,000 won on weekdays, but you need to go by car or taxi if you're going this route. And as far as transportation, Yongpyong takes about 3 to 3.5 hours by car to get to, and it has a variety of buses to take, including one that leaves right from Incheon Airport for 42,000 won, or 20,000 won to leave from Seoul on the website for tourists. And if you can use the Korean reservation system, it costs 18,000 one way and 34,000 round trip. It's also possible to take the KTX from Seoul Station to Chimbu Station, which takes about an hour and 40 minutes, and then when you arrive at Chimbu Station, you can take the shuttle bus for free, which leaves twice a day, or take a taxi which is about a 20-minute ride. That puts Yongpyong at a score of 40 out of 50, and the top overall ski resort in Korea on my list. It's just a great overall resort with something for everyone, good food, and enough entertainment to spend a really fun couple of nights with friends of the family. And that wraps up my top 5 resorts in Korea, with Vivaldi as a bonus. The ski season has started here, so I hope everyone has a chance to get out to the slopes this year if you live here, or if you're coming to travel, as it's a great way to make winter something to look forward to instead of suffering through the cold months. If the video was helpful, we'd appreciate it if you liked it, and subscribe to see more similar content in the future. And if you have the financial flexibility to do so, consider supporting us on Patreon, and I want to give a massive shout out and thanks to all that have done so. And with that, we'll see you next week with another video.